it's taking it. All right, I just wanted to look if anyone lost track. All right. Yeah. All right, let's get started. Hopefully a few of you have been to some of the other learning analytics sessions at the conference so far. We had a sort of a general session earlier, and I'm going to spend a few minutes covering the basics, but this is really focused on where is learning technology analytics kind of in the moment, and by that I mean, where is it right now today, and then hopefully we'll talk a little bit, try to talk about where it's going. There we go. All right, so first introduction of our speakers, of myself and well, whatever. So first thing I have to do is mention Unicon, because that's the group that I'm with. You're right. All right, anyway, whatever. So we're a consulting services company. As you can tell, we're a very serious group, but essentially the core is that we support virtually all the Apereo open source projects, and we're kind of a big open source company. We're a fan of open source just in general, that's what we need to say. As far as my role, I'm a software architect. My sort of areas of interest these days are really learning systems and learning analytics. And I've been involved in Sakai for a while. You'll see code from me in loads of different Apereo projects, and even projects that aren't even Apereo projects yet will be soon, like Matterport, for example. My esteemed colleague.
Aaron made me put this slide in. I wasn't going to put it in. I wanted the focus to be purely on learning analytics, but since Aaron had the Unicon slide, there's me. I work for the University of Michigan. I'm not here to sell anything. I'm just here to provide some color commentary, particularly regarding the IMS Caliper framework that's currently under development, and you may have heard of, and if you haven't heard of, you'll hear something about it in the course of this presentation. Yes, go.
And I should say, Anthony and I have worked together and known each other for many years.
We've worked together for years.
For better or worse, mostly better. All right, so learning analytics, what is it and why do I care? This is just a catch-up slide from the previous session, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. The bottom line is we're talking about how to measure and really figure out what students are doing for the purpose of trying to help them learn better. That's the really, really short version. So what are they doing, and how can we then make their experience better? This is just something I wouldn't say I tossed it together, but something I put together. I'm not a graphic artist, as is probably obvious, but I hope it at least gives you a sense of the 5 main areas of learning analytics. Essentially, we've got collection. That is, how do we figure out what the students are doing? Somehow you have to collect information about what they're doing. So there's a collection aspect. The storage. So okay, I have it in hand. I know that Aaron just went and took a test. But what do I do with that information? Well, you got to put it somewhere. So you get the storage aspect. Then there's the analysis. Okay, I've got a bunch of data. I've got millions and millions of lines of data. Now what? Okay, you have to analyze it. So that's the analysis piece. And then, well, what do I do? Okay, I analyzed it. I've got some results. I've got maybe some compiled summary statistics. Now what? Well, you communicate them out to your end users, probably to your teachers. For example, really, really extremely simple version of analytics might be saying how often students are accessing a course, right? Very, very, very simplistic. Much more interesting version of analytics would be doing predictive analytics with that data and saying how many of my students are actually likely to fail based on the data that we know today. And for example, identifying at-risk learners and then sending that information for action. And that's the 5th aspect. Action might be in a system like Student Success Plan or any number of other places where you actually take those results and do something with them. So those are the 5 aspects. What we're primarily going to be talking about today are sort of the orange pieces in that graph, the orange arrows. There are not tons of standards around this stuff yet today. So we're going to focus on the pieces where there are standards and where there's a lot of work. And the most work right now is primarily happening in the collection and storage area, and that's kind of what we're going to focus on today. Now, it'd be nice if next year we could say, well, we've got work to talk about in every single area, but it's still early days for learning analytics, and I imagine by next year we'll have different ideas about what aspects are and what parts of learning analytics. Okay, what's the Apereo LAI? This is a group that was started earlier this year to essentially try to take different parts of the Apereo community and merge them together into one sort of semi-unified group. I wouldn't call us an organization, but a group of people who are sort of working toward that same goal of having fully open source solution for all of the pieces in that diamond that I showed you before. So it's just an open community around learning analytics. Really, that's all there is to it in really very short terms.
Be a community of interest.
Yeah, community of interest. There we go. That's a good term. So what I just mentioned is this is the current diamond, so we'll focus on the current diamond. All the stuff that's kind of gray or fuzzy, there aren't a lot of solutions, or in some cases there are no solutions in those areas yet today. Certainly not in open source anyway. So hopefully next year, in June of 2015, we'll have a nice filled-in graph. That's our goal, but it'll depend on resources like anything else. Okay, so current technologies, as of June 2014, and this stuff is changing fast, right? If I had this, a year ago, then we wouldn't even have some of the things on here. It just really is a rapidly changing area. So a couple of standards, ADL's Experience API, also known as Tin Can API. I'll get into a lot more detail about that. The IMS Caliper spec are in the same area. There's also technically the events, W3C event,
activity streams.
Activity streams, yes.
Sure.
W3C activity streams is sort of in that as well, but I don't think it's a very well-defined standard, so it kind of is a little more fringe. So we're only including ADL, Experience API, and IMS Caliper. There are a number of xAPI implementations. I'm going to just touch on a few of those, but essentially things that will produce those Experience API statements. That's the term. We'll get into that later. Don't worry about it too much. I just want you to know that there are a number of things that are producing these statements right now today, and it's not just LMSs, right? So there are things aside from just LMSs that are producing this, and that's the goal. The goal is to have anything your students might interact with, not just an LMS, but also portals, also CMSs like Drupal, etc. As far as Caliper implementations, it's very early days for Caliper still. So everything that I'm pointing out down here is technically in development. So there's a Moodle sensor that's being developed. There's a Kaltura sensor. For those of you who don't know, Kaltura is just a media system, media hosting and transcoding system.
Yeah, it's important to point out that the IMS Caliper effort right now is a standard that's in active development. In fact, it doesn't exist as a standard today. The goal right now, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes, is actually to drive the work towards, certainly hopefully by the end of summer, a set of useful guidelines, but also looking forward to a full-blown version once back. But if you were to go out today and Google, you're not going to find an IMS Caliper specification yet.
It's in pre-spec, as it were. So. All right, a couple more things to mention just as far as current state of the union goes. A few more learning record stores. Now, learning record store is the other side of the coin. So the collection aspect that I mentioned, the storage aspect, the collection aspect is how do I get the data from systems where the students or whoever is interacting. And that was that first piece of the spec. Second half of the exact same specification also defines how the system would actually interact with those other ones. So when I say the system, I mean the LRS. So how that LRS can absorb that data, that's also part of the spec. Now what it does with the data after that, how it actually stores it, that's outside of the specifications. And that's true for both Caliper and Experience API. They're both sort of just different ways of saying, how do I get the data from A to B? And then everything else that happens with it as far as where it's stored and what's done with it, that's up to further implementations outside of the spec. So there are a few learning record stores out there right now today. The UVA LRS is one that's being developed by University of Amsterdam. It's coming soon. I have a little more information to mention about that, but since it's not out yet and it's not available for anyone to look at, the short version is Java-based. It uses a NoSQL backend, but it's still in development. Learning analytics, storage, and analysis as far as multifunction systems, and I struggled with titling this because the reality is that there are a lot of commercial vendors in the space, and rarely are they the bigger vendors, and they're just not focusing on one aspect. They're focusing on really a big chunk of that diamond all at once. So I couldn't think of a great name, so I switched to storage and analysis. But there's really communication involved in that, and maybe even some action involved in that as well. It's kind of a big chunk of the diamond. That's what the commercial vendors are doing at the moment. So IntelliFi Learning is one example of that. And Rusticy's watershed LRS is another example of that. And these are more than just LRSs, right? They're storing the data, but they're also processing it and doing some real analytics work on that data. So it's more than just storing, right? The tricky thing, of course, is these are all commercial. There's no open source solution out there in the market or otherwise, at least not that anybody's sharing, that does anything beyond simply just storage and maybe very, very basic reporting. All right, so let me take you through what the Experience API is. It has a lot of funny different names. So you may have heard Tin Can, you may have heard Next Generation SCORM. These are all just terms for the same thing. And I think this image, which Anthony found, and I think is actually quite good at illustrating the main concepts here, is to say that data about what the learner is doing happens all over the place. First of all, it happens in different devices, so not just in an LMS, essentially in your browser, but also maybe reading a book, or perhaps over on your mobile phone, or in Facebook, right? It happens all over the place. And the types of activities that students are doing are not always on a computer even. So sometimes you may be capturing information from actually watching a video of a student doing something and somebody manually saying, yeah, they did this. Or it may be capturing information about what a student did, not from the student, but from the person working with the student. Like, say, a tutor is working with the student and they finished a session and they go and they enter that in some random system that tracks what tutors and students are doing. It's probably not an LMS. It could be any kind of system. But you may want to record that information then out from that system to wherever. So there are lots of examples of things that could generate Experience API events, and almost everything that applies to that applies to Caliper as well, I should say. All right, so what is the Experience API? Basically a standard communication protocol between the system that's collecting or that sees the student doing something and the system that is absorbing or storing that. So it's just a communication protocol between those two pieces. It defines essentially statements, which I'll get into a little more detail about that in a minute. It also is it's a REST-based service, so we're not using SOAP for this protocol. It's just a REST-based service, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. It's developed by ADL. If you don't know what ADL is, just a part of the government who basically are also the same guys that are responsible for SCORM. Rusticy, which is a commercial provider in the space, probably one of the largest SCORM-related commercial providers, actually did a lot of the work on the development, but ADL essentially paid for it. Version 1.0 was out in April, and there was a 1.01 revision in October of last year. So this spec's been out now for almost a year and a half from version 1, or a year and a quarter anyway from version 1. But I don't think a lot of people really started using it in anger until the end of last year. So it's still pretty new stuff. And there's an introduction. We'll touch on that later. So then the natural question is, why is there why are there at least two names for this, I should say, because some people also call it Next Gen SCORM. So the short version is that Tin Can API is actually the name that they used to develop it. So it's developed under this name Tin Can API instead of Experience API, which was that was actually the name from the very beginning that ADL knew it was going to be called that. But Rusticy developed it under this code name, this Tin Can API, and then eventually they were going to change that to Experience API. But then Rusticy said, oh, we really like this other name. We like Tin Can API, so we're just going to keep calling it that. You guys can call it whatever you want, but we're going to keep calling it Tin Can API. The bottom line is they're actually the same. They're not trying to compete. There's not two separate specs. They're not forking. They're actually the same. It's just that Rusticy really likes to call it Tin Can API. ADL really likes to call it Experience API. Nobody's going to win that battle. They're just going to keep being called the same. They're going to keep calling it different names, but it's the same spec. Okay, so I mentioned before, just briefly, that there's this idea of an RDF triple. Do you want to talk on this for a second?
Sure.
All right.
Sure. Okay, so at the most basic level of describing the interactions that take place between a user and an activity, the decision was made early on with from the xAPI folks to base it on the RDF triple statement. So there's an RDF specification, and it's really quite simple. It's actor plus verb plus object, and it's known as the RDF triple. If there's anything that you can recall from this presentation by the end, this is one of the things to think about and to remember. RDF triples. When you think about the way that these transport protocols are being designed, it's to pass information in that kind of statement. So each interaction represents a statement which is of this form. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about the variations between the Experience API and this evolving Caliper framework, which actually attempts to complexify and enrich the statement. But this is just the basic way of describing that low-level interaction that you're going to capture from a particular app and then move it to some sort of record store.
Yeah. And the core, I'd say the core message is essentially to say that the user has done something, and then there's lots of complex information you can add, like what course were they in, for example, or tell me a little more about that something. Those are other parts of the spec. So it's not just as simple as only that, but at its core, the simplest statement has to be at least that. Basic architecture, this is just meant to illustrate that the data going to that learning record store can come from lots of different places. It can come from an LMS, it can come directly from a mobile device or any client, really. And it can come from other systems out in the cloud. It doesn't have to actually be directly only from one system into the record store. It's actually, in fact, LRSs are meant to be an endpoint for data from many, many systems at once. So they're designed to run fairly high scale, generally speaking. Now, I have been doing some load testing on some of the different LRSs out there, and they don't quite run as snappy as I would love, but they're pretty good. Rough calculation-wise, we would like to see ones that handle about 1,000 statements per second. An individual statement would be person did blah, right? So that just that one statement. We'd like to see about 1,000 per second. None of the LRSs out there today can handle that level, even the cloud-hosted ones. But I think that they're, it's an improving thing, so we'll continue to get better. The protocol itself looks like this. You can actually sort of almost see that triple right here. The actor is the user. The verb is user did, and what did they do, right? So they did something, and that's essentially that triple. Actor, verb, and object is just the term that's used by ADL. It's similar but slightly different in Caliper, but they're talking about the same kind of concept. All right, a few benefits, and I'm not going to go through all these, but the short version of why this is a benefit over just the normal way of collecting data is that it does actually define at least a semi-standard way of doing this stuff. So instead of trying to crunch these numbers, let's say that you're an analytics person and you're trying to crunch numbers on data from 4 or 5 different systems, it's usually really difficult to put that stuff together. You have to first establish a common language, then you have to cram the data into those different common languages, and then if you find out, whoops, this system doesn't have one of the main chunks of data that I need, right? They didn't say what the user was doing. Oh well, I guess we can't use the data from that system, we have to throw it away. If everybody adheres to a specification like this, at least you know in the end you're going to at least have that actor, the triple, essentially. You'll have at least that, if nothing else. And depending on how fully fleshed out the other systems are and their use of the API, you may have additional information as well. So at a minimum, that standard says that we're at least going to have these 3 bits. And not only that, those 3 bits are represented in a typical way. So if I have system A and system B and system C, I can put them all together into a common data set and start crunching numbers on it. So that's the main value, and that's what most of these things are talking about. The other potential value of any kind of standard, some of these are just standard values, is that it has sort of this idea of community support, right? It's out there in the community, people can look at it. And ADL is actually there are a lot of fairly nice guys. I haven't had too much trouble by that I mean the guys that work on this spec. I don't know a lot about the rest of ADL, but the guys that work on this spec have actually been pretty good to deal with and seem like very reasonable people. And they've expressed interest in working with the Apereo LAI on enhancing and improving the specification to make it more useful for learning analytics, primarily on ways to get the data back out of the system. Because right now there are good ways to get the data in. You can do general queries to get it back out, but we want ways to get it out in bulk so that we can pull out a data set of a few million records and crunch some numbers on it. The spec doesn't really have ways to deal with that yet, so we're going to be working with them to hopefully continue to improve that. There are also some risks, and this is just general risks in data collection, but I put them under xAPI. Security, right? And this is a common question we get all the time. Well, okay, we have a bajillion student records all in this one system now. Well, is that safe? What happens? Well, it better be, right? So you need some confidence that that data is going to be secure. Part of that is the reason why we're trying to push through this initiative, because, like I said, most of the stores that you saw me reference earlier are cloud-based. So you're trusting that vendor will not accidentally release that data. I mean, I'm not saying you can or cannot trust those vendors, but my point is that if it's on your servers, at least you know who's responsible if the data gets out. If it's on their servers, well, you know who's responsible, but I don't know if that saves you. So security is a big issue. Privacy, same thing. There are ethics issues, and the ethics issues are actually different. Yes, ethics issues would be, let's say I have a huge data set, and I can then use that data set to predict who is going to pass and who's going to fail. Well, am I ethically required at that point to use that data to tell the students that they're likely to fail? What if I discourage them from participating in research programs? I mean, really, you can't, it's not a guarantee. None of these things are guarantees. So really, I might have a 90% chance of failing, but that doesn't mean I will fail. So what do I do with that data? It's ethical questions. That's an entirely different sticky issue. We're going to stick to technology here today. But just to be aware that these are things to have in mind, and you want to have a strategy around it at your campus. The other thing, this stuff is all very new, right? Experience API is 1.0. Yeah, that was a big win, and the reality is that 1.0 was essentially defined by the end of the financing on that project. Will there be massive changes in 2.0? Perhaps. There could very well be. So it's early days. Getting in here early isn't cheap, unfortunately. You know, if you're coming in, you want to use this stuff. There's a lot of work that has to be done around it to make these systems work together. Part of the Learning Analytics Initiative is to try to lower those costs by doing it as a community, but it's things may change, right? The ground is shifting in this kind of area. I'm gonna let you take this one because I've been talking a lot nonstop.
Yeah. Okay. I just slipped this one in, and this is just really a teaser of where some of the thinking is going in the xAPI community. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got the xAPI, and what is it doing? It's basically collecting interactions between students and a variety of learning activities. Okay, that's useful. But wouldn't it be kind of cool if there was a way of as those interactions built up over time, that perhaps you also could be assessing those interactions and applying perhaps a badge to a stream of interactions that represents some sort of micro credential. And that's what these guys are starting to think about. So they're starting to think about taking the ideas of micro credentialing and marrying them up with this nascent learning analytics approach. And there's no guarantee this will really go anywhere, but I just wanted to bring this to your attention. And it's particularly these guys at Learning Locker that are working on this right now. They're tied into the xAPI community.
Yeah, that's essentially, and I'll get to that in just a second, but that's essentially the only real open source LRS available at the moment. Now there is this one, and I always have to make sure I mention this first. There is ADL LRS. It is open source. It's Python based. ADL put this out there. But this is not something you're going to install and run as your record store at your institution. It's just a reference implementation to show people how to do it. It's really meant for you to test against the spec. So for example, you want to make sure that your integration in some other system, let's say for example Sakai, actually adheres to the spec and sends statements correctly and that the thing picks them up and everything's working. Then you might use this to test that everything's working, but you should not run this in production. They tell you do not run it in production right on their webpage. It's just a reference implementation to show people, hey, this is roughly how you implement the spec, thanks. So I mentioned that always first so that you'll realize that is not something you should install and run, just to use it if you're doing development. These are some of the other LRS options out there. It's by no means a comprehensive list, but it is, as far as my ramblings around in the LRS world, these are the top options. This one, of course, is a sparkle in someone's eye at the moment, but hopefully it'll turn into a real boy soon enough. Rusty Swarm Cloud is the first one out there, and they're a big commercial competitor in this space, or competitor is not the word I really wanted, but they're a big influence in the space. They have a cloud-based one and a locally installed version, but there's no open source. It's all commercial. XLRS is all commercial again. They're cloud hosted only. And they actually, in our load test, were the fastest, so I wanted to mention them for that specific point. Learning Locker is open source, PHP locally installed. There's no cloud option because it's just an open source project. They're not trying to sell it as a service. They're simply putting it out there and trying to form a community around it. There is a commercial company that will help you install it, of course, and that's what's backing Learning Locker, but otherwise it's just out there for people to grab and use. They have a 1.0 very, very recently. And then the last one is the University of Amsterdam effort to build an LRS. The tricky thing with this one is that it's still in process. Alan told me to mention that it will probably be 2 or 3 weeks before they have their first version out. And it is a very thin version, but he's hoping that that will generate some interest in sort of perhaps expanding. Okay, what's the Experience API and Sakai like? I'm going to breeze through these because we covered this a bit last year, so I just want to mention it. Essentially, create an API in Sakai that can be used for learning record reporting. Right? That's basically, that was our goal. We wanted to build a collected data about what students are doing in Sakai, send it to an LRS. So we have a kernel API for it. If you're interested in digging into the guts of it, there's some information on this slide. I'm not going to talk about it. Just want to mention you can find it in the presentation. There's more information about how the surface actually works. I don't want to spend time here. If you want to know more guts about that, or the guts of that, I should say, come find me at the showcase tonight.
Does it, does it report a reasonably comprehensive set of events, or we have to modify all the tools to use it?
So right now it records events in pretty much every core tool because it actually does something moderately sneaky and just takes the current event stream and watches it. For certain things that didn't generate events that we wanted to know about, we actually added hooks in those tools. But it covers a fair number of things. I would say it could be improved. Most every single thing that does anything with Experience API out in the market right now isn't capturing every single possible event. Part of that is that eventually you don't want to be completely overloading an LRS with crap that you don't care about. So that it's kind of a balance.
Is it watching Lesson Builder?
Yeah, I think so, because Lesson Builder sends out certain events, but Lesson Builder is sort of one of these things where it triggers off things in all these other systems. So you might be doing something in Lesson Builder, but it's actually happening in another piece.
Right, assignments.
Yeah. So, assignments, for example, it absolutely is captured. All right.
All right.
Handing over to my esteemed colleague.
All right. Yes, I got dropped into this presentation about a week ago and was asked to just talk a little bit briefly about Caliper. How many people are familiar with IMS, the IMS Global? Good. Most people are. Okay. It's a standards-based organization. It involves a partnership between universities and commercial organizations that range from the behemoths like Pearson all the way to, for example, the University of Michigan, which is partner in IMS. IMS is probably most famous for the Learning Tools Interoperability Specification, or otherwise known as LTI, which of course the Sakai community, particularly Chuck Severance, has played a major role in pushing that spec along. So in a sense, in the precursor periods before Apereo, we helped make IMS more relevant than it was before. That's a good thing. So now there is a new effort in IMS to come up with a specification for learning analytics. And we'll go into the reasons why, but it all more or less makes sense. What I wanted to talk just briefly, and I don't like really putting up slides with lots of text, so I apologize for this one, but this is just the stuff of Caliper. That there is a little bit of documentation out there that you can look up, but basically what the Caliper framework will provide for institutions is as an API, a REST-based API that's called the Sensor API, which is kind of a cool name. It's also going to provide a number of libraries that will simplify implementation working with the Sensor API, and those libraries are going to be written with a number of bindings across like JavaScript, Java, Python, PHP, Ruby, and then depending on who's contributing and working on the project, it could be extended out further. Again, not unlike Apereo projects, this is being pushed by by institutions and companies that are willing to roll up their sleeves and do the work. There is some basic other concepts, the Caliper event. So remember we talked a little bit about the RDF triple statement. Caliper event is something that makes an attempt to enrich that by describing an action performed by some agent, could be a student, doesn't have to be a student, on some object over some period of time within a specified context. And it's this bit actually that Caliper in particular is interested in. And that's the context in which these learning interactions take place. Because if you think about that RDF triple statement, it's a very simple statement. At the end of the day, it doesn't tell you a whole lot. What you're really kind of interested in is within what kind of environment are these interactions taking place, and how can you capture that information as well, sort of enrich your analysis. And the way that we're going to approach that, and I'm going to jump to a picture in a minute, is through the metric, what we call metric profiles. The metric profiles are a set of information models that really provide a set of controlled vocabularies you can think of. Organized around actually quite simply actions or verbs. But a set of controlled vocabularies, Aaron mentioned earlier the challenge of receiving lots of these statements which could use a variety of verbs or different vocabularies, but then which become madness to try to, and very costly to try to figure out how to mash that data together. So one of the things that the Caliper is attempting to do is develop a standardized set of rich vocabularies with the option for extensions, but sort of well understood, standardized set of vocabularies that everyone more or less agrees to. Aaron's already mentioned the event store, so we'll skip beyond that. One of the things about Caliper is not attempting to be entirely greenfields. We are building it based on a set of existing specifications, profiles, ontologies. Over on the left-hand side, you see LIS. That's an IMS spec. Borrowing profiles from that. Looking to vocabularies from schema.org, just like the other specs, relying on RDF, using JSON LD as our transport protocol. Relying, although we're not tightly coupled with LTI. You'll see some LTI images in a minute, but we will base the specs so that LTI can serve as this is maybe not the right word, but like a mule, that it will help transport metric profile payloads across the wire, and then also sending along with it what we call a sensor endpoint, so that a particular learning app knows where to emit its activity stream data to. So we will be leveraging LTI, but you will be able to implement the sensor API without necessarily having to use it.
I'd say the easiest way to think about that would be when you do an LTI launch, you're actually launching a tool which is somewhere else, right? It's not within, say, the LMS. So let's say you're in Blackboard and you launch an LTI tool and it goes out and it's out actually running on, say, the Kaltura server. Well, that Kaltura server doesn't have access to send data from Blackboard to your LRS anymore. That's a secured stream. This guy over here can't just send stuff into your LRS, or else you'd be getting data from all over the place. However, what can happen is essentially it packages up the credentials so they can travel along in that LTI launch over to Kaltura, and then Kaltura could say, hey, the student is over here and they're interacting with this video and they watch this much of it, and you probably want to know how much they watched. So I'm going to send that, and there's two different ways to do it. Either it comes back to your server and then gets jammed to the LRS, or it can be packaged up where you send those credentials straight along to it and it goes from there over to here. But it looks like it came from this system with just a little bit extra metadata to say, oh, it wasn't actually from this guy, it was actually from Kaltura. So it's actually pretty cool, very slick stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think of LTI these days is I think of it as a negotiator. It negotiates between two applications, and then there's a agreed upon handshake, and you may pass information back and forth to one another. And then now with LTI 2.0, there's a whole discovery aspect to it, which will really, as we move forward, will enrich the experience. All I want to say about this is, as you can see, here's our triples here: xAPI, activity stream. You can see something similar: agent, action, activity, context. But it's those context blocks, that learning context, which is what Caliper is really all about, attempting to enrich and complexify the activity streams that we want to track within this more general learning context. It's really focused on the learning context that we all are familiar with within higher education. And this is just, again, what we're attempting to do is defining these metric profiles, which you can just think of for any particular learning activity. For example, a reading or a quiz or somebody marking up a document, annotation, etc., is to define for each one of those a control vocabulary that makes working with a variety of systems and their interactions and these streams coming back much more comprehensible. And they're also based on sort of a set of foundational metrics which are common to those learning activities described there, such as is it assignable, is it gradable, is it shareable, etc. Now here's I just talked about it, so I'm going to really skip through it. But here's just a sort of schematic of the LTI Caliper integration. The idea that LTI basically provides a way of not only negotiating a relationship between a consumer and a provider, but also allows the provider, for example, to let the consumer know, for example, what metric profiles it actually understands and can make available. And at the same time, the consumer can say, all right, I know that you've implemented that sensor API. I want that learning activity stream to go here. And so you pass as an endpoint. Just like as LTI today, passes a redirect URL so that the tool knows where to place itself after the launch. Similar, in some sense, pretty simple idea. Now, during the summer, and I think it's going to go into the fall, but part of the team are some pretty aggressive fellows. And what they would like to do during the summer is to develop this proof of concept environment and draft specification and a set of well-defined subset of those metric profiles that I referred to. For example, like reading, assessment, annotation, etc. And then also develop one or more sensor implementations, these little babies, that simplify implementation and make it much easier to work with the sensor API, but do it in an environment that actually, when you look at this is kind of complex. I think a lot of people, when they think of LTI, they think of an LMS, and they think of this tool right here, and there's some loose coupling, and I launch, and let's say in this particular case, it's a renderer for an EPUB, little EPUB reader. And so I launch that, and my students, etc., interact with this. But imagine if you would a world in which actually you have a set of chained LTI experiences, in which this guy, when the student starts interacting with the EPUB, maybe it has an embedded launch for a quiz, but maybe also it's not just the producer in this relationship, consumer-producer, it's also actually a consumer of other LTI-enabled services. Embedded in here in this is some video, and there's a launch that takes place there, and maybe there's a quiz that once the student reaches that, there's actually an LTI launch to reach that quiz functionality. In each case, you now have a learning context, which is getting much more complex than what it was when it was bounded just by the LMS. It's gotten a little more complex and interesting here. It's gotten a lot more complex. And if you're actually trying to understand how students are interacting with various materials in a learning experience, and for me, what I hope analytics is about is not just about students, but it's also about instructors learning from this data so that they can refine and reshape their own pedagogies to actually improve learning. And in this particular case, you actually want to capture more than one stream of interaction data. And this is the proof of concept that we're going to try and achieve during the summer of 2014, and I wouldn't be surprised if it spills over a little bit into the fall. And the goal is a draft spec in which we'll describe a set of information models. We'll also have definitions for those all-important, the learning context and activity context that help shape and make the Caliper event and those metric profiles more comprehensible. The sensor API will be in place, and then there'll be a set of, I'm just calling them best practices right now, because this is just a draft, and it's moving towards a spec, but it's not going to be a spec yet. But best practices around how you interact with that API, the endpoint service implementation, what kind of calls and methods are permissible, etc. And then alongside that, and some of these may turn out to be stretch goals, but the implementation of these sensors, these sensor libraries, we're starting one soon in Java. There's one there's working code right now in PHP. There's a little bit of working code in Python, maybe even Node for JavaScript. And then eventually, if we can get somebody with some Ruby experience to generate a Ruby sensor, and so on and so forth. A test harness, so that those who are beginning to play around with or experiment with the sensor API can actually run some conformance tests. That's something that IMS does now regularly. A reference event store.
Sort of like the ADL LRS.
Yeah, just something simple. So you've got some target to push those various streams of activities towards, and then where you saw in that previous a sandbox of that, so that we could actually demo that proof of concept, and people that are interested in the spec in terms of the way that it's evolving and maybe even working with it can actually see it in action and test it out. So those are the goals for the summer. Well, the summer of 2014, starting. I just was on a call an hour ago. Got deliverables like next Tuesday. I don't know how I'm going to get those done, but that's what we're trying to do. And again, actually, what's interesting about this is this kind of approach, which is it's fully iterative. It's leading not just with a paper doc, but actually with working code. And this is really all based on the influence and the impact of Dr. Chuck Severance, if you're aware of Chuck. I know you are. And his influence on IMS and IMS practices. So there will soon be working code for people to play with. Now, the one disclaimer or proviso about this is that IMS is not quite, the way that it organizes itself is not quite the same as Apereo. So if you went out right now and you said, okay, let me go to GitHub and get that code, you're not going to find it. It's in private repos. And it won't be made available until such time where the team wants to put it out there in the public space for people to start using. That's not my choice. That's just the way that IMS works. From their perspective, and this is something, if you see any of this and you think, this looks pretty compelling, I'd like to get involved. The way to get involved is you want to get sort of like behind the curtain, you need to become a member of IMS. That's the way it is. You've got to join IMS. As soon as you join IMS, you can get behind the curtain and you can actually start working on this stuff. Otherwise, you have to wait a little bit until it gets put out in the public space. But what's good about it, just like with basic LTI, it's going to get pushed out a lot sooner than it otherwise would have, based on IMS past practice, because we want to get the code out there so people can begin to play with it and then tell us what's wrong with it or what needs to be refined, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's, yes.
And we're actually,
Is a caliper event store an LRS?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, it's just not an xAPI LRS. So
LRS is associated with xAPI?
Technically, yeah, learning record store is a term that they use, but it's also becoming a very general term. So I think a lot of people would say LRS just is a general term for learning record store, but technically speaking, Experience API would sort of say they claimed that as theirs.
I see, okay.
Yeah. So I mean, it's an event store is the term that the Caliper spec uses, whereas learning record store is the term that Experience API uses.
But the thing just to remember right now about Caliper is really the concept of adding in a much more rich understanding of those interactions through really trying to capture the surrounding context. Just think about that.
All right, since we're totally out of time, I'm gonna skip my last section where I was gonna talk about the Sakai integration and demo it, because I'm gonna do that exact same thing tonight at the showcase. So I apologize that we're gonna have to skip that for this presentation, but come by the showcase. I'll be happy to show you, how it connects and what Learning Locker looks like. You can see the interface and that kind of thing. But please thank you, Anthony, and thank you guys for attending. We'll hang around for a few minutes if you want to ask questions, since it's becoming my standard way of overrunning every time.